They thought the courtroom was theirs. The judge, the prosecutor, and the line of police officers standing tall against one black woman. They believed they could silence her, humiliate her, and strip her of dignity in front of the world. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. When the officer's hand struck her face, the sound echoed like a gunshot, sharp, brutal, unforgettable. For a split second the room froze. Gasps filled the air and every eye turned toward Camille. They expected her to crumble, to bow her head, to be reduced to nothing more than another casualty of the system. Instead she rose higher. In that moment something shifted. The slap meant to break her only exposed the rot in the system. The courthouse wasn't just a stage anymore, it was a battlefield. And the woman they mocked as powerless was about to seize power in the most shocking way imaginable. What happened next would leave the entire courtroom and the world speechless. Because within seconds of being struck, Camille would make a move so bold, so unthinkable, that history itself would have to pause and take notice. This was not humiliation. This was the beginning of a takeover. The county courthouse was already buzzing with tension long before the hearing began. Every seat was taken, the air heavy with whispered speculation. A young black woman named Camille stood at the defendant's table, her posture straight but her eyes sharp with defiance. She was not an ordinary defendant. To her supporters, she was a community leader, a voice who had spoken out against corruption and racial injustice. To her enemies, she was trouble, someone who refused to stay in her lane. The charges against her were thin, built on paperwork that barely held together, but it wasn't about the charges. It was about sending a message. The police wanted her silenced, and they had chosen the courtroom as the stage. The officers lined the walls in uniform, their presence loud without words. Camille's family sat behind her, nervous but proud, knowing what was at stake. As the judge entered, the room fell into silence. The trial began, but it was less about justice and more about intimidation. Evidence was mishandled, objections ignored. The judge seemed uninterested in fairness, almost rehearsed in his dismissiveness. The prosecution painted Camille as reckless, even dangerous, twisting her activism into something criminal. The longer the proceedings dragged on, the more it felt like a performance with a pre-written ending. Camille refused to lower her gaze. Every dismissive gavel strike, every smirk from the prosecution, only hardened her resolve. The audience could feel it, something was about to break. And then it did. When Camille questioned the fabricated claims against her, the courtroom erupted. She wasn't shouting, but her words carried fire. The prosecutor bristled, the judge grew impatient, and the police shifted uneasily. One officer stepped forward, his face tight with authority. Without warning, his hand lashed out. The crack of the slap echoed through the chamber, silencing everything. Gasps filled the courtroom. Camille's cheek burned red, but her eyes burned hotter. The officer stood there, unrepentant, certain he had reasserted control. The judge did not scold him. Instead, he slammed his gavel and ordered order, as if the violence was routine, as if nothing wrong had happened at all. But the moment had already shifted. Something in the room snapped, invisible but undeniable. The crowd murmured, anger simmering just beneath the surface. Camille stood taller than before, her silence more powerful than any outburst. The slap had not broken her. It had ignited her. The police thought they had humiliated her. Instead, they had set the stage for a transformation no one in that courtroom was prepared to witness. And as the officer's hand lowered, the audience could already sense it. This story was not going to end the way the system had planned. The air was heavy, the silence stretching, until Camille's next move would decide everything. The chapter closed not with a gavel, but with the unshakable knowledge that the woman they tried to silence was about to turn their world upside down. The officer's hand fell back to his side, but the courtroom did not return to order. The slap had unleashed something larger than anyone could control. Camille stood still, her cheeks stinging, yet her presence dominated the room. The silence that followed was no longer the silence of obedience, it was the silence of anticipation. Everyone was waiting, watching, sensing that history had just been provoked. The judge banged his gavel again, his voice cold and commanding, but the authority in his tone no longer carried weight. The people in the gallery, once passive observers, now leaned forward, restless. The mask of order was cracking. The officers who lined the walls shifted uneasily, their rigid stances betraying nervousness. They had used force to remind Camille of her place, but instead they had revealed the fragility of their own control. Camille lifted her chin, her eyes scanning the courtroom, not with fear but with ownership. She wasn't supposed to be standing there as a defendant. She wasn't supposed to be standing at all after what had just happened. But she refused to bow. The audience felt her defiance like a wave filling the room, making it impossible to look away. The judge demanded silence, demanded submission, but Camille's presence swallowed his authority whole. And then, in a move that no one could have predicted, she began to walk. Slowly, deliberately, she moved away from the defendant's table. The officers hesitated, unsure whether to stop her. Their training told them to restrain, but something about the way she carried herself made them freeze. Step by step, she approached the bench. The crowd murmured louder, the tension rising with every footfall. The judge's gavel slammed frantically, his voice straining with panic now, not power. But Camille never broke her stride. She ascended the steps, each one echoing with finality, until she stood where only authority was meant to stand. The judge rose in outrage, pointing and shouting, but in that moment, his fury looked like desperation. Camille turned to face the courtroom, her presence commanding more than any robe or gavel ever could. The slap that was meant to destroy her had transformed her into something greater, a symbol of resistance sitting in the very seat of power. The gallery erupted, voices rising in disbelief and awe. Some shouted in support, others in shock, but all eyes remained fixed on Camille as she lowered herself into the judge's chair. The officers reached for their radios, the prosecutor's face drained of color, and the real judge sputtered in disbelief. Yet, even amid the chaos, no one could deny what had just happened. For the first time, the courtroom belonged to someone it was never meant to. Camille didn't just take the seat. She claimed the authority behind it. And the question that lingered in every heart was simple. What would she do now that she had it? The room erupted into chaos the moment Camille sat in the judge's chair. Some in the gallery gasped, others cheered, and a ripple of energy surged through the courthouse like a storm breaking free. For years, that bench had symbolized untouchable power, an elevated throne from which verdicts were passed down without question. Now, a young black woman, once branded a defendant, sat there as if she had always belonged. The judge's fury was explosive. He shouted for order, his robe flaring as he tried to wrestle back authority. But his words were drowned out by the noise of the crowd. He looked less like a figure of justice and more like a man exposed, stripped of the respect that once cloaked him. His own gavel, his symbol of control, lay powerless in Camille's hand. The officers finally moved, closing in on the bench. Their boots pounded the floor, but their steps carried hesitation. The people in the gallery rose to their feet, shouting, blocking, creating a barrier between Camille and the officers. The courthouse was no longer a chamber of law. It had become an arena of defiance. Camille sat firm, her eyes unflinching, her presence radiating unshakable resolve. The slap had awakened something in her, but it had also awakened something in the crowd. People who had come to watch quietly now shouted boldly. They demanded accountability, demanded respect, demanded justice. The authority in the room was shifting by the second, bleeding out of the robes and uniforms and into the hands of the people. The prosecutor, pale and sweating, tried to shout above the noise, declaring Camille a criminal, a threat, a danger to order. But his words collapsed under the weight of the crowd's roar. Every accusation he hurled sounded weaker than the last, drowned out by chants rising from the gallery. The judge demanded her removal. The officers hesitated. None dared make the first move. Each step forward threatened to trigger a riot, and every man in uniform knew it. Their power no longer rested in their weapons or authority. It was Camille who held the room captive, Camille whose every movement dictated what came next. And in that charged silence, she leaned back in the chair, her posture calm, her gaze steady. It wasn't about theatrics, it was about ownership. She didn't steal the seat. She claimed it as her rightful place. The gallery could feel it. The courtroom could feel it. Even the judge, red-faced and trembling, could feel it. For the first time, the system trembled before the people it was supposed to control. And though the walls of the courthouse had seen countless trials, none had ever prepared for what was about to unfold next, because Camille was not finished. Not by a long shot. The weight of silence settled again, but it was no longer silence of respect. It was the silence before a collapse. Camille sat in the judge's chair, steady and unyielding, while chaos rippled through the courthouse. The officers stood frozen, their radios buzzing, awaiting orders no one dared to give. The judge barked commands, but every word fell hollow, stripped of its former power. His fury was loud, but it sounded small compared to the storm Camille had summoned. The gallery surged with energy. Ordinary people who only hours ago sat in quiet submission, now roared with courage. Their voices rose in unison, chanting her name, demanding justice. They weren't just witnesses anymore. They were participants in a rebellion that had sparked within those walls. The courthouse, built to symbolize order, had transformed into a stage of revolution. The prosecutor, frantic, demanded Camille's arrest. His words trembled with desperation, knowing the system was slipping through his fingers. But every time he spoke, the crowd drowned him out, their voices stronger than any legal declaration. The law no longer belonged to him, it had shifted into the hands of the very people he sought to silence. The officers finally attempted to act, stepping toward the bench. But the crowd surged forward, a living barrier between Camille and those who would drag her down. Mothers, fathers, elders, students, all pressed closer, their bodies forming a shield. For once, the fear belonged to the uniforms. One wrong move, one act of aggression, could set off a fire that could never be contained. Camille did not shout. She did not flinch. She simply remained in the seat, her posture regal, her gaze unwavering. She was calm in the chaos, and that calm radiated power. Her silence spoke louder than 1,000 protests. It declared that she belonged there, that she had taken what was denied, and that she would not be moved. The judge slammed his gavel so hard it cracked against the wood, the splintered sound echoing like the breaking of the very system he represented. His face turned pale as he realized the truth. The authority he had wielded for decades was gone. A single act of violence, a single slap, had unraveled the entire illusion. Outside the courthouse, the noise grew louder. Word had spread like wildfire. Crowds were gathering at the steps, demanding entry, demanding answers, demanding justice. The courthouse doors shook as chants echoed from beyond the walls. The system's fortress was crumbling, not from fire or stone, but from the power of a people who refused to be silenced. Inside, Camille leaned forward in the judge's chair, her hands resting on the bench as if it had always belonged to her. She didn't need to speak. Her very presence declared victory. The system had cracked, and now the world was watching to see how far it would break. And Camille, calm as ever, looked ready to shatter it completely. Outside, the courthouse steps thundered with the voices of hundreds who had gathered after hearing what happened inside. Cell phones streamed the chaos live, spreading Camille's defiance across the city in real time. Every chant, every cheer, every second of her sitting in that chair was already bigger than the walls that tried to contain it. The courthouse had become the beating heart of a movement. Inside, the judge was unraveling. His commands had lost weight, his gavel splintered, his face drained of authority. 4 years he had ruled this chamber with unchallenged power, but now no one was listening. Even the officers hesitated, their glances betraying uncertainty. The slap that was meant to restore order had instead flipped the entire hierarchy upside down. The prosecutor shouted about law, about order, about the sanctity of the system, but his words cracked under the noise of the people. He spoke of rules, yet everyone could see the truth. The system had rules for some and different rules for others. Camille had exposed it all by simply sitting where they said she never could. The officers edged closer, radios blaring with frantic commands from superiors who themselves had no plan. But the gallery, once silent observers, stood as a wall. Their voices filled the room, demanding protection for Camille, demanding accountability for the slap, demanding justice long overdue. Every step the officers tried to take forward was pushed back by the rising wave of defiance. And through it all, Camille remained calm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't beg or plead. She sat in that seat with the gravity of someone who had carried the weight of injustice her entire life. In that chair she was not just Camille, she was every silenced voice, every bruised body, every name forgotten in courtrooms like this one. She was a mirror held to the system, and the system could not bear the reflection. The judge, trembling now, shouted for her removal one last time. His voice cracked, desperate. But as he did, something unexpected happened. A loud crack echoed, not the gavel, not the judge's voice, but the sound of the courthouse doors swinging open. The crowd from outside had forced their way in. The flood of people surged through the halls, pouring into the courtroom, their chants shaking the very foundation. The officers were swallowed by the crowd, their authority drowned in the sea of bodies and voices. Camille, still seated, became the center of it all. The people looked to her, not the judge, not the prosecutor, not the uniforms. In their eyes she was already the authority. And in that moment, one truth was undeniable: the old system had fallen. The gavel no longer belonged to the judge. It belonged to her. But what Camille would do with it, that was the question the entire nation was about to ask. The courthouse had transformed into something unrecognizable. What began as a trial designed to break Camille had become a revolution within 4 walls. The chants of the people reverberated through the chamber, shaking the marble floors, echoing off the high ceilings. The old symbols of order, robes, badges, gavels, looked powerless against the living force of unity that had claimed the room. Camille sat at the bench, the fractured gavel before her. The judge stood off to the side, diminished, no longer a figure of authority but a man stripped bare before the people he once ruled. The officers had been pushed back, their power useless against a tide they could not control. The prosecutor's voice was gone entirely, swallowed by the roar of the crowd. And yet, Camille did not revel in chaos. Her presence was steady, her silence commanding. She understood what was unfolding. She knew this moment was bigger than her, bigger than the courthouse, bigger than the slap that started it all. This was not just defiance. This was reclamation. The crowd fell into a hush, waiting, watching. Camille lifted the gavel, the same gavel that had once silenced voices, dismissed lives, and enforced injustice. For a moment she held it high, her hand steady. The image froze in the eyes of every person in that chamber and every viewer watching on screens across the city. Then she brought it down. The sharp crack rang louder than any verdict that courtroom had ever heard. But it was not a sound of obedience. It was the sound of a system breaking, the declaration that things would never be the same. The people erupted, their voices filling the space not as spectators but as owners of justice itself. Camille rose from the chair, the gavel still in her hand, and faced the crowd. She did not need words. Her action had spoken for her. The slap meant to silence her had birthed a moment that would echo through history. She had turned humiliation into power, fear into fire, and a courtroom into a revolution. Outside, the streets overflowed with people chanting her name, holding signs, demanding change. News cameras captured every angle, broadcasting the fall of the gavel and the rise of Camille to every corner of the country. The system tried to frame her as a defendant, but she had left the courthouse as something else entirely. An icon, a leader, a judge not by title but by truth. That day would be remembered not for the slap, not for the trial but for what came after. The moment a black woman sat where she was never meant to sit and showed the world what justice could look like when taken back by the people. The courtroom no longer belonged to the system. It belonged to Camille. And through her, it belonged to everyone who had ever been told to sit down and stay silent. The trial ended. But the movement had just begun. If Camille's story shook you, don't just scroll away. Hit subscribe to Twilight Tales for more gripping dramas that expose injustice and spotlight resilience. Comment below. Was Camille right to take the judge's seat? Turn on notifications so you never miss a tale that will leave you speechless. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because here at Twilight Tales, every story is more than just entertainment. It's a wake-up call.